Hello and welcome to Behind the Bar. Today we're having a little look at all things American whiskey. So I brought in my resident whiskey expert, Fred Siggins, to have a little chat about it. We have just gone over the history of American whiskey and now we're going to have a little look at the styles. To start off at the very basic, what is bourbon and what is rye?
So when we're talking about American whiskey, generally we're talking about whiskeys that are produced in the United States and Canada to a certain extent, but we'll get to that in a little while. So the two primary styles of American whiskey that we've got coming out of the United States are bourbon and rye. So bourbon is a corn-based whiskey and rye is based on rye grain. And at its most basic level, that's the difference between the two.
Yeah.
So with rye, you're going to see that be a lot drier and spicier because that's the flavor profile of those grains. With corn, you're going to see it be a little bit sweeter and softer.
And is that then where you kind of tend to see the variations between different brands of whiskey, is just in those kind of levels and spice levels and sweetness levels?
Because with a bourbon, it has to be made with at least 51% corn, but generally a lot higher. But there usually is some rye in there. And with a rye, it needs to be made with at least 51% rye grain, but there's usually some corn in there as well. So it can be a bit confusing because there's a lot of crossover between the two styles. But yeah, you might have a rye whiskey that's got a very high rye content and very little corn. So it's going to be particularly dry and spicy. Or you might have one that's just got sort of close to the minimum amount of rye. And so it's going to be a little bit softer and sweeter, and then the same thing in reverse with bourbon.
Does the aging have a pretty big impact on the flavor as well?
In terms of aging with American whiskey, it's really interesting because all American whiskeys are aged in brand new, heavily charred American oak barrels. So for the most part, the flavor profile that's coming from the oak is relatively similar across styles. Your average age for bourbon usually tends to be around 4 to 6 years.
And you get, you know, that's enough time in that
Plenty.
hot climate to have heaps of oak kind of showing in it already.
Absolutely, especially when you're using those brand new barrels. With some of the younger ones, we're going to see a lot of stone fruit, bananas, cherries, vanilla, fresh flavors. With the older ones, you start to see a little bit more leather, tobacco, varnish, forest floor type characters. And generally speaking, with older whiskeys, you're just going to find a little bit more texture and complexity.
So obviously we've got a nice little array of a few different bourbons and ryes and a few little outliers there as well. So we can have a chat through all of the different flavor profiles that you can get from this spirit category, and maybe have an idea of, you know, what ones to use in certain cocktails and things like that.
Well, let's start with bourbon because that's the biggest, it's the most popular, and it's the one that has the most different styles associated with it and maybe can be a little bit confusing to understand what the difference is from one bottle to the next.
Yeah.
So I'll start with Buffalo Trace because for me, this is a really good example of a traditional bourbon, right? It's got a pretty traditional mash bill, meaning there's going to be a very high percentage of corn in there. There's going to be a little bit of rye just to make it a little bit more interesting. But for the most part, we're talking about a pretty stock standard, very high quality, easy to work with, traditional corn-based American whiskey. Got lots of nice oaky notes coming through from those fresh American oak barrels. But, you know, it's not too crazy in terms of age or in terms of alcohol content. So it's a really good benchmark for just a high quality, traditional American bourbon.
Yeah, so it's definitely one that you would reach for, you know, your old fashions and kind of some pretty classic American whiskey cocktails.
Absolutely. It's the one that I often just have in the rail because it sort of ticks every box that you need for a stock standard traditional bourbon. Goes great, you know, just with Coca-Cola or in a cocktail or as a shot, however you want to do it. It's pretty much just going to work for that.
Cool.
So moving on from there, the next obvious example would be what we call a high rye bourbon. So it is still a bourbon, meaning it's the majority of what's in there is corn, but it has maybe a higher proportion of rye grain in there than something like a Buffalo Trace.
Yeah.
And so a good example of that would be Bulleit. So that just means that Bulleit bourbon is going to be a little bit drier and a little bit spicier than a traditional bourbon whiskey. Still perfectly reasonable to use in old fashions and bourbon and cokes and any of the kind of standard applications. But there's just going to be a slight difference in flavor there, with the Bulleit being a little bit drier and spicier.
So it is a pretty fun thing to play around with, especially in the bar. You can actually make some really quite different, old fashions or Manhattans or whatever, just like literally just by switching out the whiskies.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you're talking about two products that are around the same age and around the same price point. So it's really just a matter of preference between what you want, what your customer wants, and being able to know that they're going to just make slightly different cocktails.
Yeah.
The next style of bourbon that I'll talk about, because we're talking about the different grains and how that affects the flavor profile, is Maker's Mark, because that is what is known as a wheated bourbon, which means that it's still mostly corn because it is a bourbon, but instead of having rye grain in there as that little extra bit, they've put wheat instead. And what that means is that it's just going to be a very soft, easy, sort of approachable style of bourbon. If you imagine the difference between rye bread versus like standard tip-top white wheat bread, then you can kind of get a sense of the different flavors that are going to end up in the whiskey on the basis of that.
Is that your standard bread? That's what it's called here? Tip-top?
Tip-top, yeah.
That's cute.
Delicious.
It's actually a pretty easy one to get on board with because it is a little bit softer and a little bit sweeter.
Definitely. And I think that with Maker's Mark, it also doesn't have quite as much of that aggressive oakiness as a lot of bourbons do. For whatever reason, I'm not entirely sure, but it's just a little bit softer on the palate, both in terms of the oak and in terms of the grains that they're using.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty good place to start. And when it comes to cocktails, it makes a really beautiful, soft, very approachable style of old-fashioned or Manhattan.
Yeah.
So Elijah Craig, the standard bottling is 12 years old, which means it's going to be a little bit more expensive because obviously it costs a bit more to age whiskey for longer.
And that's really quite old in the world of American whiskey. Like obviously 12 years is kind of really just a lot of the time where Scottish whiskey starts.
Absolutely. It's a little bit less common and certainly more expensive when you start getting into 10, 12, 15-year-old bourbons and ryes. And once you start to get up into the 20, 25 years, then you're talking about incredibly rare and incredibly expensive whiskeys where, a 20-year-old single malt Scotch is pretty easy to come by.
Yeah.
So Elijah Craig, 12-year-old, is a really good upsell. If you just want to say, hey, would you like a cocktail that's got a little bit more kind of depth to it, but it's also just an absolutely delicious sipping whiskey for people who want to drink it straight.
Yeah.
Next, we will talk about Woodford Reserve. Woodford Reserve bourbon is a little bit of an outlier, I suppose. It's kind of a unique brand because it's triple distilled. Most bourbons and rye whiskeys in the United States are just double distilled. So they go through their first distillation generally on a column still to just, strip out the alcohol, and then the second distillation on a pot still to create a little bit more sort of nuance and texture. But Woodford Reserve is actually triple distilled, meaning that it's just going to be a little bit lighter and a little bit more refined. So again, works really, really well in an old fashioned, takes on other flavors really well. Doesn't kind of compete with other flavors as much as some other American whiskeys will, because it's got that nice sort of refined flavor profile.
Yeah, cool. You do have the little Gentleman Jack on the end there, which is obviously one iteration of the Jack Daniel's machine. Jack
Daniel's is classified as a Tennessee whiskey, which technically is actually a subset of bourbon, although you probably shouldn't say that to somebody from Tennessee because they're very proud of their particular state's style of American whiskey they make. I say that it's a subset of bourbon because it is still made with a majority corn mash bill, so it kind of ticks all the boxes for being classified as a bourbon. But in Tennessee, their whiskeys also go through an additional process during production, which is called the Lincoln County process. And it's basically after they're done distilling, so they've got the new make whiskey, but before it goes into the cask for aging, they filter it through a really thick layer of sugar maple charcoal pellets. And so what it's doing is just filtering certain things out of the whiskey, which in my mind probably helps it take on some of the sweeter characteristics that are coming out from the oak. generally speaking, with Tennessee whiskeys, you're just going to see them be a little bit bigger and a little bit sweeter, and some more of those kind of nutty banana bread characteristics coming through.
Yeah.
I mean, when you're drinking Jack Daniels, you know you're drinking Jack Daniels. It's definitely quite a full-on flavor
It's always
profile.
the warm bananas.
Yeah, banana lollies.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's the main flavor profile, is that kind of banana lollies, banana bread thing. So if you're drinking Jack Daniels, you know you're drinking Jack Daniels. If you like it, great, because it's a solid product that really does what it says on the box. If you don't like it though, don't be scared off from bourbons or American whiskeys in general, because that's quite an intense flavor profile, and there are definitely other ones out there that are quite different.
Yeah, cool. Stick around for the next episode where we'll have a little look at rye.